Swedish defense firm Saab wants Canada to buy and build its fighter jets. The firm is pitching a partnership with Bombardier and promising to create up to 10,000 jobs along with it. This comes after Prime Minister Mark Carney ordered a review of Canada's F-35 contract.
What if the most reliable ally of the United States is quietly preparing to rewrite the rules of power, trade, and security in North America? Not through confrontation, but through calculated choices that could permanently weaken Washington's leverage? That question is no longer theoretical. It is unfolding right now. Canada, for decades, one of the most predictable partners of the United States in defense, manufacturing, and trade, is signaling a strategic shift that touches the core of a global trade war already reshaping alliances. From fighter jet procurement to electric vehicle markets, from agricultural tariffs to industrial policy, Ottawa is testing boundaries that once seemed immovable. But here is what makes this moment truly unsettling. These moves are not isolated. They are connected, strategic, and deliberate. And by the time you reach the end of this analysis, one overlooked detail may completely change how you understand who is gaining power, who is losing leverage, and why the next phase of this trade war may not be led by the United States at all. For decades, defense and trade between Canada and the United States followed a predictable formula. Canada bought American. Canada aligned early. Canada absorbed the cost of dependence in exchange for stability. That formula is now under visible strain. According to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, roughly 3/4 of Canada's military procurement spending over the past several decades has flowed to American defense contractors. This arrangement was not accidental. It reinforced interoperability, secured political goodwill in Washington, and quietly locked Canada into the strategic orbit of the United States. The assumption in Washington was simple. When Canada needed to modernize its Air Force, the decision would be American by default. Canada is actively evaluating the Swedish-built Gripen fighter jet as an alternative to the American F-35 program. This is not merely a comparison of aircraft performance. The Swedish proposal includes domestic production, technology transfer, and the integration of Canadian engineers directly into the manufacturing process. According to public statements by the manufacturer and Canadian industrial agencies, the program could support up to 10,000 skilled jobs within Canada. This marks a structural shift. Instead of exporting capital and expertise south, Canada would anchor high-value aerospace activity at home. For the United States defense industry, this represents more than a lost contract. It signals the erosion of a long-standing presumption that loyalty in security procurement was guaranteed. At the same time, Canada is reassessing its trade posture in a separate but equally consequential sector: electric vehicles. Canada currently maintains the highest protective tariffs in the group of 7 against Chinese electric vehicles, a policy closely aligned with the trade war strategy pursued by the United States. Yet signals from Ottawa suggest that these barriers are no longer untouchable. This convergence of defense diversification and tariff reconsideration is not coincidental. It reflects a broader calculation that dependence itself has become a strategic risk. What Washington must now confront is not whether Canada can make these changes, but what happens if it does. Because once procurement pipelines and tariff walls are altered, the leverage that sustained American influence for decades does not return easily. And the most destabilizing element in this story has not yet fully entered the public conversation. It involves a third actor, operating quietly, with far more to gain from this realignment than either Canada or the United States. Behind every strategic realignment, there is an economic aftershock. And in this case, the shock would be felt first not in cabinet rooms, but in factories, dealerships, and household budgets across North America. The automotive industries of Canada and the United States are not merely connected, they are intertwined. According to data from the United States Department of Commerce and Industry Supply Chain Studies, vehicles assembled in either country routinely cross the border multiple times before reaching a consumer. Engines, transmissions, batteries, and software components move back and forth in a tightly choreographed system that has evolved over half a century. If Canada opens its market to Chinese electric vehicles, even partially, price pressure would be immediate. Chinese manufacturers currently dominate global electric vehicle exports, driven by lower battery costs, scale manufacturing, and state-supported infrastructure. Analysts at the International Energy Agency have documented that production costs for Chinese electric vehicles are significantly lower than those of North American producers. For Canadian consumers, the short-term effect would likely be lower prices and broader model availability. For American manufacturers, the effect would be far less comfortable. Price competition would intensify, margins would shrink, and the cost of maintaining domestic production would rise. The human consequence of that shift matters. Hundreds of thousands of workers in the United States rely directly or indirectly on automotive manufacturing linked to Canadian demand. Assembly plants in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky depend on a protected North American market. Once that protection erodes, even slightly, pressure moves quickly from balance sheets to payrolls. Trade wars often promise job protection. In practice, they frequently deliver job displacement first, followed by long and uncertain transitions. Tariffs are often discussed as tools of leverage. Rarely are they discussed as costs absorbed by ordinary people. Over the past decade, multiple studies from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the International Monetary Fund have shown that tariffs tend to raise consumer prices, distort supply chains, and slow productivity growth. In the United States, tariff-driven cost increases have already contributed to higher vehicle prices, higher repair costs, and longer replacement cycles for consumers. If Canada alters its tariff structure independently of Washington, the ripple effects could be politically destabilizing. American manufacturers would face a competitive imbalance, while American consumers would ask why vehicles sold in Canada suddenly cost less than similar models sold at home. That comparison matters. Price gaps become political arguments, and political arguments become pressure points during election cycles. There is also a fiscal dimension. Lower margins mean lower tax revenues at state and local levels. Communities built around manufacturing hubs feel the impact not as abstract statistics, but as delayed infrastructure projects, strained public services, and declining regional investment. This is where the trade war framework begins to fracture. What was designed as a shield against external competition becomes, under shifting alliances, a source of internal strain. Canada's calculation appears to acknowledge this reality. Diversification is not framed as an ideological statement, but as insurance. Insurance against supply disruptions, insurance against political volatility in the United States, insurance against a future where economic dependency becomes leverage used unpredictably. For Washington, this raises an uncomfortable question. If the closest ally begins to hedge against American policy risk, what message does that send to other partners watching closely from Europe and Asia? Because the consequences of this shift do not stop at cars or tariffs. They point toward a deeper erosion of the assumption that the United States sets the economic terms by default. And there is one additional consequence, still largely absent from public debate, that could accelerate this transformation faster than policymakers expect. It involves not jobs, not prices, but the credibility of American leadership in the next phase of the global trade war. That is the fault line that comes next. From Washington's perspective, Canada has never been just another trading partner. It has been the quiet cornerstone of North American economic planning. Supply chains, defense coordination, and industrial strategy were designed around the assumption that Ottawa would move in lockstep with the United States. Trade data from the United States Census Bureau consistently shows Canada as either the largest or second largest trading partner of the United States, depending on the year. Entire regional economies in the Midwest and Northeast depend on stable access to Canadian markets. When Canada adjusts its tariffs, it is not merely changing trade policy. It is altering demand signals that ripple directly into American factories and communities. Within the context of the global trade war, Washington has relied heavily on alignment among allies to justify protective measures. Tariffs were framed as collective defense against unfair competition, not unilateral protectionism. Canada's willingness to reconsider those tariffs weakens that narrative. Defense procurement amplifies this concern. Military interoperability between the United States and Canada underpins continental security planning. When Canada evaluates non-American platforms, it introduces uncertainty into long-term coordination, training, and logistics. For defense planners, uncertainty is risk. Politically, the timing could not be worse. Inflation remains a sensitive issue for American voters. Manufacturing job security continues to dominate electoral messaging. Any perception that the United States is losing influence over its closest ally feeds directly into broader anxieties about decline. The quiet fear in Washington is not retaliation, it is precedent. If Canada can diversify without immediate punishment, others may follow. Outside North America, Canada's actions are being read very differently. In Europe, defense manufacturers and policymakers view Canada's openness as validation of strategic autonomy. Sweden's Gripen proposal aligns with a broader European push to reduce over-reliance on American systems. Canada is seen not as defiant, but pragmatic. China's interpretation is more direct. Beijing has long sought to fracture the unity of Western trade policy. By signaling flexibility on tariffs and market access, Canada presents an opportunity. The reopening of tourism channels and the potential lifting of agricultural tariffs are transactional moves designed to reward cooperation and encourage further divergence from Washington's line. This matters in the broader trade war context. China does not need to defeat the United States directly. It only needs to demonstrate that alignment with Washington is optional, costly, and reversible. Other countries are watching closely. Middle powers in Asia, Latin America, and even parts of Europe face similar dilemmas. Dependence offers stability until it does not. Canada's recalibration offers a case study in how to hedge without confrontation. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Push too hard, and it accelerates diversification. Do nothing, and it normalizes independence. The deeper issue is credibility. Leadership in a trade war depends not only on economic weight, but on the confidence of partners. When partners begin to plan for a future where American preferences are negotiable, the balance of power shifts quietly but decisively. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that none of these shifts require dramatic announcements or public breakups. They unfold through procurement decisions, tariff adjustments, and market access agreements that seem technical but compound over time. And there's one final element still missing from the public conversation: a structural vulnerability in the United States trade war strategy that Canada's moves are beginning to expose. Once that vulnerability becomes visible, the consequences may extend far beyond North America. At first glance, Canada's recent moves can be framed as diversification, a rational response to a fragmented global economy and an increasingly volatile trade war. But diversification at this scale is never neutral. It reshapes incentives, alliances, and expectations for decades. Canada's strategy appears to rest on a simple but powerful premise. Dependence is no longer stability, it is exposure. In the past, alignment with the United States guaranteed market access, defense protection, and predictable rules. Today, those guarantees are conditional. Tariffs can appear with little warning. Supply chains can become political weapons. Election cycles can overturn long-standing commitments. By expanding defense procurement beyond American suppliers and reopening economic channels with China and Europe, Canada reduces the risk of being cornered. It gains leverage, it gains optionality, and it gains bargaining power in future negotiations with Washington. But this strategy carries real danger. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner by an overwhelming margin. Disruptions to cross-border manufacturing would not spare Canadian workers. Retaliatory tariffs would hit Canadian exports immediately. Financial markets are highly sensitive to perceived political risk. The calculation in Ottawa appears to be that these risks already exist, that remaining dependent does not eliminate them. It merely delays their impact until Canada has fewer alternatives. In this sense, Canada is not rejecting the United States. It is preparing for a future where American policy is less predictable and less forgiving. This is where the story becomes more unsettling for Washington. Trade wars rely on unity. Tariffs work best when allies absorb costs together and deny rivals alternative markets. The moment that unity fractures, the burden shifts inward. If Canada adjusts its tariff regime independently, the United States faces a choice: escalate and risk damaging its closest economic relationship, or tolerate divergence and weaken its own negotiating position globally. Neither option is comfortable. More importantly, Canada's actions expose a structural weakness in the United States trade war strategy. It assumes that allies fear disengagement more than the United States does. That assumption is increasingly uncertain. Canada's example suggests that medium-sized economies can hedge quietly. They can reduce exposure without open confrontation. They can accept short-term friction in exchange for long-term autonomy. Once that lesson spreads, tariffs lose part of their power. They become less a tool of discipline and more a catalyst for diversification. For American consumers, this has consequences. Reduced leverage means less ability to shape global prices. It means higher costs absorbed domestically. It means trade wars that last longer and deliver fewer clear victories. For American workers, it introduces instability into industries long considered secure: automotive manufacturing, defense supply chains, and advanced manufacturing all depend on integrated allied markets. What makes this moment dangerous is not that Canada is acting alone. It is that others are watching, learning, and preparing. And here is the twist that changes the entire picture. The most disruptive outcome of Canada's shift may not be Chinese electric vehicles or European fighter jets. It may be the slow normalization of a world in which the United States no longer sets the default terms of trade for its own allies. Once that normalization takes hold, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. And the next phase of this trade war will not be announced with tariffs or speeches. It will unfold quietly, contract by contract, market by market, until the balance of power looks very different from what Washington planned. That realization leads directly to the final question: whether this moment marks the beginning of strategic renewal or the first visible crack in American economic leadership. In global trade and security, intentions matter less than signals. And the signal Canada is sending now is unmistakable. By diversifying defense procurement, reassessing tariffs, and reopening channels with Europe and China, Canada is not merely protecting itself against risk. It is signaling to the world that alignment with the United States is no longer automatic, unconditional, or permanent. For decades, the strength of the United States in trade wars has rested not only on economic size, but on credibility. Allies aligned because they believed that access to the American market was more valuable than any alternative. That belief allowed Washington to impose tariffs, set standards, and shape global rules with confidence. Canada's actions quietly challenge that assumption. If a country so deeply integrated into the United States economy can reduce exposure without immediate collapse, the logic of dependency weakens. Other governments notice, finance ministries notice, corporate boards notice. This is how power shifts in the modern trade war environment. Not through dramatic breakups, but through risk management decisions repeated across sectors and over time. The danger for the United States is not that Canada succeeds or fails in isolation. The danger is that Canada proves something that cannot be unproven. That diversification is survivable. The greatest risk to the United States is not losing a fighter jet contract or facing cheaper electric vehicles in a neighboring market. It is the erosion of expectation. For generations, American policymakers could plan on one assumption above all others: that when pressure was applied, allies would close ranks, that tariffs would discipline behavior, that economic gravity would pull partners back into alignment. Canada's recalibration introduces a new variable into that equation: choice. Once allies believe they have viable choices, the calculus of trade wars changes. Tariffs become negotiations rather than commands. Influence becomes conditional rather than assumed. This does not mean the United States suddenly becomes weak. It remains the largest economy, the most powerful consumer market, and a central security actor. But it does mean that leadership must be exercised, not presumed. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the United States may not fully recognize the shift while it is happening. Trade wars move faster than institutions adapt. By the time consequences appear clearly in employment data, investment flows, and alliance behavior, the strategic ground has already shifted. Canada's move may be remembered not as an act of defiance, but as the moment when the era of inevitability quietly ended. And that leads directly to the final reckoning. If the United States no longer defines the default path for its closest allies, what replaces that leadership? Cooperation based on mutual benefit, or competition shaped by fragmentation? The answer to that question will determine not just the outcome of this trade war, but the structure of the global economy for a generation. What is unfolding between Canada and the United States is not a rupture, but something more complex and more consequential. It is a recalibration of power in an era where trade wars, tariffs, and strategic dependency no longer produce predictable outcomes. Canada is not abandoning its closest ally. It is testing the limits of dependence in a world where economic security, industrial resilience, and political stability are increasingly fragile. By diversifying defense procurement, reconsidering tariffs, and expanding its range of global partnerships, Canada is asserting a principle that many countries quietly share but rarely act upon. That dependence carries costs. And so does independence. For the United States, this moment demands clarity. Influence can no longer rely on assumption. Leadership can no longer depend on inertia. In a fragmented global economy, power must be maintained through cooperation that delivers tangible benefits, not pressure that accelerates diversification. The trade war era has entered a more subtle phase, one where decisions are made quietly, contracts replace speeches, and long-term consequences appear only after leverage has already shifted. The question now is not whether Canada's strategy is bold. It is whether the United States is prepared for a world in which even its closest allies are no longer willing to accept dependency as destiny. Is this a strategic reset that strengthens North America, or the first warning sign of a deeper erosion of American economic leadership?